Hi, everyone. I'm Pam Tenaerts. I'm the Chief Science Officer at Medable, a decentralized clinical trial company. And I'm very happy today, very excited to be talking to Katelyn Jetelina, somebody whose blog I've been reading for a long time and always gives me information. And I've sent it to people who are not medical at all. Everybody gets information out of it. So it's amazing. So thank you and welcome. And thanks for joining us today. Katelyn, do you want to maybe go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit and sort of tell us about yourself? Yeah,
sure. Yeah. Hi. Thanks for having me. I am a epidemiologist. I have my own research lab at a research institute, a university, and I also teach epidemiology and public health. And that's what I was doing before this pandemic. And then, the pandemic hit and epidemiologists, we're all really called to have an all hands on deck response. And so no matter what your research lab really focused on, all of us really started working on COVID-19, not just out in the field, but also a few of us started communicating what we were seeing in the science to the layman and to other types of scientists. And so I've found myself on the forefront of really both of those, really responding to COVID-19 in the community, as well as communicating it along the way.
Great. And I mean, as you said, you've had a little bit of a front page to this whole pandemic sort of, evolving and developing. Can you tell us a little bit about how COVID has shaped public perception of clinical research through this pandemic and sort of the perception of science?
Yeah, I think for the really first time for the general public, we are seeing science unfold in real time. And that has caused a lot of confusion. It's caused a lot, misinformation, even disinformation campaigns. Not only epidemiology, but we've also seen clinical trial research unfold in real time with the public. And I think it's both, like I said, confusing, but also really rewarding. I think it's really elevating our public to think through what are our processes, how much we rely on other people to raise their hands and participate in clinical trials, and how much goes on behind closed doors. I think this is one of the first times me especially pays attention to FDA meetings and find them exciting, and so I think it's really brought a spotlight on every aspect of research through the pandemic, and especially clinical trials.
I think that's true. And as somebody who's worked in clinical trials for a long time, and the last decade specifically around improving clinical trials and sort of understanding that if we want to have new medical products, they stand on the shoulders of a randomized clinical trial to show that a product even makes a difference. Because every time you give somebody something, there's side effects. And so the benefit has to outweigh the risks, and sort of this whole evolution of things, and how painfully slow research was, and how prohibitively costly it was. I think we all were working on that in the background. The pandemic has made that abundantly clear, and we've shown that you can do it better. So do you think that there's a different view now on what it means to participate in clinical trials?
I think so. I hope so. I think a lot of people look at, we had a lot of money. Every scientist in the world was working on a vaccine at the same time. And those factors really contributed to us having good vaccines and therapies in 9 months, right? But I think one thing that has been lost in the narrative is how many people stepped up to volunteer in clinical trials. I think I saw a number of like 500,000 or something. And that is mind blowing to me as a researcher. Usually, pre-pandemic, it's hard to find research participants. And people really rolled up their sleeve and signed themselves up for these. And we really owe it as a community to these volunteers. And I really hope that that isn't lost when we start self-reflecting on this pandemic, both the negatives, but also the positives, and seeing the value of that participation, and how it got us to solutions, public health solutions really quickly. And so, yeah, I sure hope that it improves participation. Particularly, I hope it improves generalizable participation in clinical trials that we certainly have been missing in the past few decades. But yeah, I think it's all really to be determined. You know,
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add, I think the other thing that people really saw is how rigorous our clinical trials are. Just from the pediatric COVID-19 trial that, FDA and Pfizer had to report that a 5-year-old swallowed a penny, and that wasn't, linked to the vaccine. And, it's very detailed. There is a process, right? What's phase 1, what's phase 2, what's phase 3, what's the difference between an EUA and a BLA? And so I think all of that, and how clean the process has been, at least from the vaccine perspective of development, it can only suit us better for the future.
I think that's true. And I think I want to hone in on something you said about that clinical trial participation should reflect the population that lives with whatever the condition is that's being studied. And in COVID, I think some of the vaccine makers had to halt their enrollment a little bit to make sure that they enrolled the right level of diversity as it is reflected in the American and in the world population, because a trial results can only be extrapolated when it includes the people that actually are then having the condition that you were studying. So can you talk a little bit more about what that actually means, that generalizability that's so important, and that we did well with COVID, but even last week there was a study published on asthma medication in kids, and it wasn't a diverse population of the kids that actually live with asthma, and sort of this, we've seen it all come to fruition in COVID, but what can we learn for other diseases, and how can trials change to sort of make that more reflective of the people living with the disease?
Yeah, and this isn't necessarily a new problem. And yeah, the COVID-19 vaccines did try very hard to get a more diverse population, but they certainly didn't have a demographic that reflected the US population. And that is bad for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, you want representation because people's are very different. Their genetics are very different. The environments in which they're a part of are very different. We can try and control for those confounders through randomization, but that doesn't necessarily always mean it works. The other thing that I thought really brought to life during the COVID-19 clinical trials that could have been improved was the way that we measure disease and side effects among women compared to men, specifically with the concerns of menstrual cycles, that was completely missed in the clinical trial. Because it's not systematically recorded, and it's never been. So it's not just, a racial, ethnic, I think, equity perspective. I think it also has to do with age, also has to do with gender and sex. And really, so we know what will happen with these vaccines once we do roll it out to that target population which was, the entire population with COVID-19. And so I know things have gotten better over the past couple of decades, but they certainly can improve still. And that's going to take a lot. It's going to take a lot of proactiveness from, vaccine manufacturers. Even the FDA may be requiring something. I think it's also going to take a lot with communication, and showing the value of participating in a clinical trial and building trust among communities so that they will participate. And that is something that I haven't seen done well so far.
Yes, I was gonna pivot to communication, so I'm glad you sort of automatically went there anyway. But so do you think that we're getting better at it? I think it's been, as scientists, when you look at trial results, we often kind of know what they mean because we have a lot of, there's background that you have. So how can we do better with communication? Because it's, medicine is not, it's still a little bit of a, there's a lot of unknowns. And if a disease is new, there's even more unknowns. So can you maybe extrapolate a little bit on that?
Yeah, there's a lot of nuances in science, and that those nuance, if you're not careful enough with your communication, those nuances can get lost and confused. And so have we done better with communication? As an at a national level, I don't think so. I continue to be disheartened from, for example, the CDC that hasn't come out like at all to talk about Omicron. I think that our communication needs to be improved. During COVID-19, I particularly paid attention that vaccine manufacturers were releasing press releases with their data without scientists being publicly, seeing that data themselves. And while a lot of those press releases turned out to be true, there was one or two that were incorrect. And so I think we have to be really careful with going down that path, that there's a value in peer review and not science by press release. So I don't know, I think we're ill prepared for the pandemic in terms of communication. And I think that we can learn a lot from it going forward for our next pandemic, or even, our other clinical trials for other health diseases that we do every single day.
I think that's right. And thanks for that thoughtful answer. Do you think more people, has communication helped in having more people be interested in participating in clinical trials? I think the statistics are something that below 10% of most people participate in the clinical trial. And yet every time we take a medical product, we benefit from that very small group of people historically. I think the last 2 years, there's been more, like you said, 500,000 is amazing. But do you think there's more people interested now? Have you sort of found that in maybe comments on your blog or sort of other places?
Yeah, it's been interesting. So I think what has come out is, I don't know if more people will volunteer themselves and raise their hand. I think what's come out is the appreciation of those that do. So for example, when I have a popular Facebook page, and when someone says, I'm so excited this data came out, my kids were in this clinical trial. I mean, the amount of praise and support from thousands and thousands of people to that individual is just mind-blowing. It's emotional, because people recognize that their 5 to 11-year-old couldn't get the vaccine without that other kid and that other mom really raising their hand and I don't know, taking that risk. It's a trust jump. And so I think that's what's really come out. I'd be curious to see if, post-pandemic, we as researchers have an easier time with research and getting people to participate than before. But we'll just have to follow that data. I'm not sure.
I think part of it, and I think you're so right, that the gratitude of people that have participated is visible everywhere, right? I mean, we're, like I said, we stand on those shoulders of the people that did. I think partly it's the research community. We have not always made it easy for people to participate in clinical trials, whether that is as a participant or whether that is as a research site to sort of administer that research study. Do you think, have you heard any comments around some of the vaccine trials used questionnaires on a phone? So they were trying to, there's efforts underway with decentralization in clinical trials to make it easier for people to participate, not just so that they can, but so that we can actually have a more diverse population too, because sometimes the people that we need to participate, I mean, they can't. It's just literally impossible, even if they would want to, because they'd have to take time off from their jobs, they'd have to find babysitters, they'd, all those practical things that get in the way. Do you have any thoughts on that, on sort of this movement to digital technologies? I don't print my boarding pass anymore. So I fill out a paper questionnaire. Like, why can't I do this on my phone, or if it's something larger on my computer? Any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I personally love the use of cell phones and whatnot, in the clinical trials. And even we saw this with like V-Safe, right? When we got our vaccines and we could answer very easily what our symptoms were that day because we got a text message. And there's a lot of value in that, because the more generalizable that data is, the more people, more people we can get to do it. The concern I have, though, that I think really needs to be thoughtfully planned out when doing this sort of thing is, again, the equity perspective. That if you are texting someone, you are making the assumption that they have a phone, that they have a phone that has enough money on it to receive text messages, and that they have, are connected to 4G or have internet services. And so you will still miss a large proportion of people that make up Americans that are, have to prioritize their money elsewhere. The other, so that's, more of the income disparity. But then I also start concerning myself with the age disparity too. I think that, if we want to enroll older people in clinical trials to really see the impact on, for example, Alzheimer's or whatever, then we really need to meet them where they're at. I think, with time, more and more people will get more and more comfortable with technology. We're just kind of growing up with it now, but there are certainly still people out there that are not comfortable with it. And really hurts the generalizability perspective of clinical trial, or could hurt the generalizability perspective of clinical trials, unless it is very clearly tracked and analyzed. And so I guess that's my really only concern, my concern, but I do appreciate the accessibility, especially as a working mom that is way too busy. I appreciate it from my perspective.
And I think it's a really good point. And Rob Califf at the Galian meeting a couple of weeks ago, and looks like he's online to be the next commissioner, mentioned that we cannot only create trials for the digitally enabled, whether that is, whether you have the capabilities, the know-how, access, because you might have Wi-Fi, but some communities in certain cities pay for as much Wi-Fi, they just get less of it. There's different things that are going on, and we need to make sure that we access everybody that we can, that we don't create a different kind of diversity and only cater to the digitally enabled. And I think as technology companies, we need to be aware of that and work through that. As we think about how research has changed and how some of that has helped some of these trials be a little easier, the vaccine trials that had those bring your own devices so they could do it on their own phones, questionnaires, what excites you about the future of clinical trials? Where do you think this is all going? And what excites you about that, of the decentralized clinical trials, and sort of like, what is the positive side, if we can take care of not leaving anyone behind, because that's obviously not a good idea. So what is exciting about that?
Yeah, I mean, I am a data health scientist, and so I am geek over this all the time. I think it's very exciting that we can leverage all types of data sources to analyze health outcomes and the impact of interventions. Whether that be through electronic medical records, whether that's through logging, whether that's through mobility data, we can start answering a ton of questions more accurately than ever before. And because of that, our health will only improve over time. I think we really just need to take the public along for the ride, and really communicate that, like we are trying to do with the pandemic, in real time, and show the value of that.
Yeah, I think some people are sort of hoping that this prediction of the learning healthcare system, where every interaction that anyone has will contribute to the future health of future generations, sort of,
Mhm.
that we can get to that space where it's embedded in what you do. Somebody once told me that, your coffee pot knows when you wake up, right, in the morning. So can what are some of those things that we can leverage that now we don't do? Um, when you think of technologies and how that can improve healthcare, there's measurements we can do now that we've never dreamt of measuring objectively, like sleep and mobility. Can you sort of talk a little bit about how healthcare and clinical trials are sort of moving into this, like a new aspect of health that we didn't know about before?
Yeah. And it's actually something I do on a daily basis with my own research. I actually work with police officers. And so one thing that we've been trying to answer is, how does cumulative stress among over a police officer shift impact the relationship that police have with their community? And as you could probably imagine, measuring stress is incredibly difficult. But we have technology to do that now. We actually putting smartwatches on police officers and measuring their O2 intake and their heart rate to see, to measure stress, and then triangulating that with departmental records of where were they at that time that their stress went up, and how can we put into place systematic interventions to reduce that, so the interaction between police and the community are more positive, so we can decrease use of force, we can decrease traumatic events. I think is just a slither of an example of how we can leverage multiple things. One, smart devices that follow your physiological movement over the course of a minute to hours, and then two, system-wide data sources. And then, we then marry that with what the officers say. Is it annoying having their watch buzz while they're on a 911 call? Or how can we improve that for their sake as well? And I think that's just one small example of all of the infinity of possibilities that we have to improve health for humans.
And I think the way you describe that is really interesting, because with my clinical trials mind, I'm immediately going like, ooh, if they can measure stress, imagine then how you could see whether a medical product can improve your stress, right? In a more objective way, potentially, something that gets measured, in addition to maybe a questionnaire of how did you feel. This would then give you sort of information that before, having studied medicine 20 years, 30 years ago, that was never part of the equation, right? So that would be a new way of looking at health and disease. And then, as it kind of goes hand in hand, sometimes those measures get identified through clinical research, and other times they get identified through work, what you're doing, and then that can be applied in clinical trials as another way of making a trial more easy to participate in, because the stress would be measured automatically if you could figure out what that actually looked like and what sort of that the measurement is.
Yeah, and the better the tools we have to measure stress, right? It's really exploring where that can go. And I think what you're getting at is that can that be an outcome that we measure over time? And I think it certainly can be in the next 5 to 10 years, once we get a better understanding of what that measure means, and is it truly what we're hoping it means. I think so.
Yeah, so it's an exciting time. It feels like we're sort of on the cusp of learning that much more about what it means to be healthy and what that means to patients and how we can get products that can help us there. Pivoting back a little bit to communications and why some populations don't know that clinical trials are an option for them. Do you have any thoughts on that? Have you learned anything in these last 2 years about sort of that part of it?
Yeah,
And also change that potentially, if you know.
yeah, I don't know if it has to do, I don't think it has to do with that we just have to communicate more to people. There are certainly groups that have legitimate concerns about clinical trials or, research in general. And so I think that we, in order to communicate to them, we have to engage those stakeholders, and we have to ask them, and we have to understand, how could I approach this church to recruit for a clinical trial or this study? What's the best way? Who's the messenger of this? How can we equip that messenger or that champion to talk about this? And that's not something I've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, not in just the clinical trials, but all over. And understanding that telling is not always going to be the answer. We also have to engage with the two-way street and try to answer their questions while we go too.
And I think Operation Warp Speed obviously launched a lot of clinical trials in treatment and vaccines, but I think they've also started thinking around how we can have more community-based research. I mean, for a while there, if you think about the centers that were doing research, and it goes back to this diversity question also, but more maybe rural or urban or something, that kind of axis, that research, the centers that were ready to do research weren't always where the patients were that were having COVID. So for a while there, I think North Dakota, South Dakota, and if you look at where the National Health Institutes of Health academic centers are, where broadband is, all those things are sort of not where North Dakota and South Dakota necessarily is. So,
Yeah.
we've made it hard. And I think, do you think government and decentralization is becoming a big part of that? Like, how can we sort of think about decentralization and having a solution, have that be part of the solution?
Yeah, I think that is part of the solution. I guess my biggest question is then what's the implementation, right? So we have to build that grassroots network in order to have those I don't know, those legs on that network to reach the people we want to. And so I don't know if that's government. It could be, but it certainly could be other people too. And certainly if we have a distrust in government right now, it may not be best if it was them. But again, we need to mobilize that. We need to engage the stakeholders. Even if it's just, your corner urgent care and getting them to recruit. It would be a little more comfortable, I think, for a lot of people than having someone from the big city come in and say, hey, take part in our clinical trial. And so, yeah, engaging those champions and for the buy-in, I think is going to be one of the most important things in growing that decentralized network.
I think it's about non-traditional research sites, right? Sort of meeting the patients where they're at in their communities. Yeah. And what are those places where they go to regularly that are, their doctors are usually trusted people that they go to, but community doctors aren't always able to engage in the complicated research studies that have been set up. And sort of with decentralization, maybe some of that can be alleviated. Maybe sort of in conclusion a little bit, as an epidemiologist, what are you seeing that is really, that was really surprising in the clinical research space that you assumed, that you didn't assume would have happened? Maybe the positives, the negatives, sort of, I think you probably looked at clinical research more than you ever have as part of, trying to clarify what all those things were that came out and how to put that in context, and it's not black and white. So what were some of the things that were surprising to you, positive, negative, barriers to access, equity, all those things?
Yeah, I mean, specifically with the clinical trials, I think the most surprising thing to me was that it was exciting and cool to show up at an FDA meeting and hear and listen to 8 hours of presentations. That would not have happened before a pandemic. And some of these meetings get thousands and thousands of people tuning in. And so I've been continued to be very surprised about that level of engagement, that people are curious, that they do want to know what people are saying about this, what the, external scientific committees are saying. And I don't think we ever gave the layman or, non-scientists the credit that they did want to know before. And I think that is something that really hurt us before. And so to me, that tells me that the public wants to know what an mRNA vaccine is, what's in it, how does it work, why do we have side effects? Why do some people not have side effects? Why does the vaccine only work 2 weeks after it was distributed? Why don't we have more antivirals, right? And so really talking through the science is something I've been continued to be pleasantly surprised that people want to know.
I think that's right. And having been in trials for 30 years, I'm not sure I ever listened to an AdCom before these last 2 years. I knew they were happening. I had friends that were sitting on them. I kind of knew they happened after then the FDA, so, the AdCom gives their disposition and determination, and the FDA takes that back and sort of does their thing with it. I think the other part that I personally hope people saw was the dedication of the science community to this whole thing, that the science community really came together and collaborated in ways that we haven't appreciated, or, they've collaborated before, but I think that sort of seeing that in action to me was really nice. And I hope that people, I think the FDA people are amazing. I mean, or EMA, or, all those people that try to do the right thing for the right people. So.
Yeah. And it's not letting up, right? So these people continue to show up. I mean, we're recording this December 16th in the middle of Omicron. I have never seen this many scientists burning the midnight oil so everyone else around can know what's going on and prepare. I think it's just an amazing international community and shows the value of teamwork on every level. And so, yeah, I completely agree. The dedication and the time that everyone has spent doing this, the amount of people that have volunteered for the clinical trials, and are really, all of those people to me are the unsung heroes during this pandemic. And that's really what's providing solutions here on out.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's the whole community coming together and the willingness of the community to look at novel ways of getting the right answers without lowering the bar for evidence. I mean, I think, there wasn't a willingness for everyone to sort of go like, how can we make this happen without lowering the bar, using some of those decentralized tools, things that maybe weren't quite as deployed before that now, because of speed, we needed to. So in conclusion, how do you think this COVID, it's not an experiment, this COVID.
It is an experiment, basically.
This COVID thing is going to influence research going forward? Do you think? Because, there's people that have had diseases for years, oncology patients. I mean, at some point they look at this and go, why can't this be done for other, why can't we use this, what we learned, and apply it to areas where there is an unmet need? We don't have medications. There's 7,000 rare diseases. We approve about 120 some, medical products for those. It takes a while to get to 7,000 if we're going to go at this. But, so what do you hear about that? Maybe as a last question.
Yeah, I think that people need to recognize that we've never had a disease in which every single scientist on Earth is working towards at the same time. And we can see that with SARS-CoV-2, it can it generates beautiful things. I just don't think that that level of engagement is going to be possible with every disease out there. I do think, though, that with the pandemic, we have built very strong scientific teams that are multidisciplinary and that can work together going in the future for other diseases. Two, I think that we now have a very innovative approach to vaccines. And we now know mRNA vaccines work really well. And so what does that mean for allergies? What does that mean for cancer treatment? What does that mean for other, malaria? I think we can leverage this innovation for other diseases. And so I think, that, and then also what we've really touched upon is the larger community seeing how science unfolds and hopefully seeing how exciting it is and how much it does change our lives, and to hopefully get them engaged in future research, clinical trials, and other observational trials as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think some of the new methodologies we've used in clinical trials as part of that innovation, not just the medical products, but the methods themselves that may help, that in and of itself will help a lot of the disease, because we can use those bring your own device methodologies, decentralization to bear on other diseases. So it's easier for those patients to participate as well. I think we're going to leave it at that. I would like to thank you for all answers. I may just call you again on the side and talk about it. So thank you very much. And
yeah, thanks for having me. This is fun.